So I want to cover some of the basic concepts of establishing a health system inside our game using Playmaker and Unity. And inside class, there were a couple of questions that came up that I want to address just briefly. The first is that I have this little player character that's like kind of a little rocket, little spaceship model, and I have a couple of different controls on it. I can rotate my rocket ship, and it kind of stands back up, and then I can click my mouse to apply a thrust, and that applies an upward force. And I'm handling that through multiple state machines. So you can add multiple state machines to an object. I'm going to select my player object. And I just want to point out that I have multiple state machines assigned to this object. And you'll notice that inside the Playmaker editor window, there's this little drop-down menu here that shows you the active state machine that you're looking at. And I currently have 4 state machines that are attached to my player object, and this allows me to break down the separate functionality into small, little manageable machines. I was running into a glitch with the rotation when I tried to apply a player controller machine that handled both thrust and rotation. I was running into a little bit of a bug that I could work around, but I have this thrust, and I have the capabilities to decide whether it has enough fuel or is out of fuel to thrust. But the basic mechanic is that I'm pressing the mouse, and when I press the mouse, it applies a thrust, and it pushes that object up along its y-axis. Okay, and when I release the mouse, it resets and no longer applies that force. Well, I've separated that out into the rotation in a separate state machine. That way I don't need to track for rotation whether my mouse is up or down. So now I have one state machine that's handling the thrust, and then I have another state machine that allows me to roll my left and right axis, which is the keyboard, the A and the D keys here, to cause my little spaceship or my little rocket to rotate left or right. In fact, I'm using a torque. I'm not using a rotate, so I'm applying a physics force, and there were a couple different reasons for that, which I'll talk about later. But so I have these different state machines that are doing different things, and that allows me to work around a couple of issues that were created, and it also allows the state machines to be very small and manageable, much more precise, and allow for the squashing of bugs much more efficiently. I want to point that out that I have multiple state machines because when I select this object, if I look over here in my inspector, you can see that for every state machine that I've introduced, I have a Playmaker component, a Playmaker script component that's been attached to it that has the name of the state machine that's been attached. So if I change my state machine or I go to this drop-down menu, you see I have one for bomb, get position, rotate, and thrust. Each one of those correspond with a Playmaker component. And if I want to disable a functionality to test something, well, I could disable my thrust by simply unchecking this. Now when I hit the play button and I click, nothing's happening. There's no thrust happening. There's no force that's happening. So I'll just turn that back on. So if you want to disable the state machine, this is the best way to do it. In addition to that, by default, when you create a state machine, there's a setting here that says show state labels. So if I turn that back on, you'll get these labels that pop up in your game that help you debug the different states. So you can see that right now my little player says idle, and then when I click on it, it says thrust. That's showing me the state. Oops. That's showing me the state labels, so it's telling me what state I'm in, and that allows me to track and squash some bugs. So if you want to turn off those labels, when you get beyond the testing phase, what you would need to do is go into each individual object and make sure that you've turned off the show state label for each machine. Now that we've done that, what I want to do is I want to spend a little bit of time talking about setting up a health system. So I want my player to have a health and ultimately a health bar or some kind of variable that we track that when we run into bad stuff, obstacles, it subtracts from our overall health. And getting the logic, getting the mechanic worked out in a concept is very simple and straightforward. And if you don't know how to get started with the logic, in this situation, what I would suggest is just get started with the bad thing that, the object that you want to collide with, and start thinking through the logic of it. And so, it's always best to kind of think this through on paper before you start to apply it. But in some cases, it's not a bad idea just to come up with a proof of concept and experiment to see what the solutions are. And in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a real simple game object. I'm going to start with a cube. And this cube, I'm going to scale it up a little bit so it looks different than everything else around it. In fact, I might bump its Y up to 4 or maybe 5 or something, and I'll kind of set this down. This cube, I'll change its name from cube to bad cube, okay? And I'll just drag a simple material on that, so I got a really clear indicator that, you know, I'll use red. This is something I want to avoid during my prototype phase of my game. And what I want to do is I want to build the basic logic using Playmaker to get an action that detects, well, when my player runs into this object, execute an action. And so I'll get started with this, and you can see that already when I hit the play button, I can control my little player here, and I can bump into it, and I can you know, land on top of this object if I want to. And you know, so I can interact with this object already. And what I want to do is I want to start testing for collisions with this object. And so with my bad cube selected, what I'll do is I'll add a simple state machine, and I'll start off with an initialization state, and I'll add a finish transition and quickly flow into an idle state. So this initialization may come in handy. I might not use it, but it's always good to have it. I can always add it after the fact too if I want to. But for now I have this idle state, or this is kind of a listening state, and it's waiting to see if there's a collision that's been had with my player object. Now, it's important to point out, if I select my player object, that I've already tagged this object with a player tag. And what I mean by that is that I've selected the player, I've gone into the inspector, and in this tag drop-down menu, I chose to change it from untagged to player. Unity by default comes with a player tag, but I can add my own keywords that I can use as tags by simply choosing add tag, and then I could start typing in different elements that I want to use. Now, the Unity project comes default with a player tag, and I'll borrow that, and I'll tag this with player. And the idea here is that I'm going to listen for a collision with my cube. And if I decide to shoot some projectiles with my player, or if I have some bad guys flying around, or maybe maybe there's an explosion and these cubes go flying and run into this cube, I don't want to listen for any collision. I want to specifically listen for the player collision with this object, because I don't want to shoot this and have this thing subtract from my health. Because remember, the bad cube, its goal, its reason for being here is that if our player runs into it, subtract from our overall health. So again, I don't want to listen to any collision. I want to listen to a collision with a player. And the way that I could listen for that is to make sure that my player object is selected and tagged with player. Now when I go back into my bad cube object and I go into the idle state, what I can do is I can go into the physics action, and I'm looking for a collision event. So I'm going to listen for a collision event, and I'll double click. I have that now added to the idle state. Now in the collision event, I want to listen to a specific kind of collision, and I want to listen to on collision enter, which is when I enter a collision. I do have some other options if I wanted to do a collision stay, exit, or a more specific on control collider hit, but on collision enter is exactly what I want to do. I want to test to see what the object is tagged with. So I don't want to use untagged. I want to see if it's tagged with player. So if it is tagged with the player, I want to send an event. Now I don't want to send a finished event. What I want to do is I want to create an event that is we'll add damage or domage. Let me correct that. Let's add damage. And I'll add that little transition. So we want to add to our damage. And in our state, we'll say this is our take damage or our damage state, however you want to label this, whatever concept makes sense. So this is our take damage. This is the actual state where we're applying that. So the event is add damage. So in other words, when I have a collision enter with an object that is tagged with player, I can send to an event. I'll send that add damage, which is wired over to this take damage. So now what I can do is I can test the basic logic of this machine that I just built. Now, let me toggle that off for a minute, because you can see when I hit play, it framed this state machine and kind of cut off that little take damage. So I'm just going to move that down here so I can see this function. So I can see my entire state machine here. I'll hit the play button. I'll take my player and I'll just go run into the object. And you can see that when I hit it, I end up in this take damage state. I'll test it again. Hit the play button. I can see that I'm in the idle. So I'm sitting and waiting. I'm listening for taking a damage. And now when I fly over here and I land or bump into the object, it takes damage. Now the take damage, we'll want to just take an instance of damage and we'll ultimately subtract from a health variable that we'll create. But for now, just in testing the logic, what I want to do is I'll just add a simple finish transition. And later when we add some actions, what will happen is that we'll be in this listening state. When we bump into that object, we'll take damage and we'll flow right back out into our listening state. And so the idea is that I can bump into my object, I'll apply damage, and then I go right back into listening for damage again. Now, I'll probably create a scenario where I wait for a little bit of time before we reset so that we don't find ourselves in a situation where if we're kind of bouncing a little bit on this object, it completely, accumulates all of this damage. So we'll build a little safety mechanism in here that says wait a second or half a second so that we can kind of collect our bearings and get away from this object again. But we'll iron out those issues in the design phase. But now I have the basic mechanics set up. I have my basic strategy that I can test the logic, I can test this machine, and everything looks like it's working just fine. In the next presentation, we'll talk about tracking a health variable, a global variable that we can then use to track our overall health and take damage with this simple machine. We'll do that in the next presentation.